Hey, what's up? It's Mr. Dean, and since I'm currently working on some other big projects at the moment, I thought why not do another mini episode on a game that I wanted to share some of my thoughts on. This will be a much faster paced video than normal. If I should do more of these miniature videos on my thoughts on games, let me know as I am experimenting with this concept. Anyway, this is over Donkey Kong Country 3, let's go ahead and get right into it. So a while back I did videos on the first two Donkey Kong Country games for the Super Nintendo, and just for a quick recap, I loved them. Despite me only playing both games once and almost a year ago, there are still so many songs and levels from each game that I remember fondly. That doesn't happen all too often with how many different titles I cover on the channel, but this was certainly a case where the memorability of both DKC games stood out. They were both also the good kind of difficult, where it was rewarding to keep playing through each level until it felt like I had mastered it. So before I went about playing this game, I already had seen reviews of it that were pretty polarizing. There are people who think that this is the best one in the series, and others who consider it the odd one out, which piqued my interest in trying it out. So I'll just go ahead and rip the band-aid off. I didn't really have a lot to say about this one. There are some really cool things about it, but at the same time there are some aspects of this game that kind of annoy me. Now a lot of people complain about this game for a variety of reasons, like the music and art style, which I don't really agree with much of those two things. The music is definitely not as memorable or captivating as the first two games, largely because the director of the soundtrack is completely different. The first two games' soundtrack was directed by David Wise, however the third game was led by Evelyn Fisher, which is likely the cause of this. Like I said though, it isn't like the soundtrack was bad or anything, it just carried out a different vibe from the original. As for the art style, this game does take on a lighter and more playful tone than the original, however that doesn't mean that the game doesn't reflect the eerie tone of the first two games at all. There are definitely some levels here that have a darker vibe, which is nice. In fact, I don't think that this game being brighter and more playful than the first two games would necessarily make it worse anyway. Obviously, if you prefer one vibe over the other, that is completely fine, however I personally think that that is a pretty subjective take to have. As for the other new things going on here, we have the introduction of Kiddy Kong as a brand new character in our little platforming party. In the first game it was Donkey Kong and Diddy, then it was Diddy Kong and Dixie, and now it's Dixie Kong and Kiddy. Now Kiddy is the only of the characters in the trilogy to not really be an iconic character outside of it. Like, to be real, I had never even really heard of him. He is supposed to be Dixie Kong's cousin, and he is on this adventure with us for some reason. I don't know, just know that he is here and the game doesn't really explain any further than that. I don't hate Kiddy as much as some other people do, however I don't really like him either. He is just a really nothing character to me. Another new thing introduced in this game was the overworld being more open, with it allowing you more agency in how you go about completing the levels. Instead of it being a completely linear path, now you use different hovercrafts in order to traverse the water to get from level to level. This was a neat addition, however unfortunately for me this is kind of where my compliments to the game end. This game for one thing had probably the worst pacing in the series. The other two games felt pretty consistent with how the difficulty ramped up throughout the game. The first two levels were pretty easy on you, however it gradually ramped up to being quite the challenge by the end. Here though, it started out way easier than the first two games for me, and then the climb up to being difficult felt much more steep towards the middle. And also a lot of the levels that were difficult here felt a lot more tedious than fun, especially compared to the previous two titles. Now don't get me wrong, I am not calling this game bad by any means, it just had a much more difficult job in following those games up. I would just be lying if I said that I enjoyed this one on the same level as those other games. There were still interesting concepts for the levels in this game too, like quickly jumping up a tree while a Saul is coming after you, or dodging lightning strikes in a forest. It's just by this point I think I was just kind of fatigued, since at its core the gameplay is still very similar to those other two games. Also, to be completely honest, I thought that the boss fights in this game were kind of disappointing. They weren't bad, it's just none of them really stuck out to me. Anyway, that's all for this video. Maybe in the future I will revisit the series and have a deeper second look. I know this video was short, I just unfortunately didn't really have the time to do a normal breakdown on this game like I typically would. In conclusion though, this was a pretty fun platforming game at its core, it just stood out the least to me out of the trilogy. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, peace out.